Before we get started, Representative Hurley would like everyone to join him in the Fitbit challenge. So if you have a Fitbit, please see Representative Hurley. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Peter Ambrose. Here. Ed Bateson. Here. Mary McCullough. Keith Varian. Bill Gerber. Here. Tim Lynch. Present. Eric Newman. Here. Cindy Perham. Here. Heather Dean. Present. Alex Durrell. Here. Alexis Harrison. Here. Robin Orris. Here. Julie Gottlieb. Jennifer Hochberg. Here. Phil Pierce. Here. Liz Esma. Here. Josh Garskoff. Here. Ruth Smay. Here. Carol Way. Here. Jay Walk. Here. Matt Ambrose. He's here. Hannah Gale. Here. Ray Newberger. Here. Janice Solomon. Here. Tom McCarthy. Here. Mark McDermott. Here. Jill Vergara. Here. Karen Wackerman. Here. Hank Ferentz. Here. Pamela Iacono.
Here.
Christine Messina. Here. Pete Tallman. Here. Brian Farnan. Here. Drew Georgiadis. Ken Lee. Here. Bill Perugini. Here. Sam Cargill. Here. Paul Fattabine. Michael Hurley. Here. Eric Sunman. Here. Thank you.
Will you all please rise for a pledge of allegiance and remain standing for a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you. First item on the agenda is to consider and act upon the minutes of the regular meeting held on February 29th, 2016. Moved by Representative Bateson, seconded by Representative Dean. Is there any discussion on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Item carries. Item number 3, to hear, consider, and act upon the following resolution as recommended by the Board of Selectmen. Resolved that the Town of Fairfield establish the School Safety and Security Building Committee, authorize the preparation of schematic drawings and outline specifications for the project, and authorize the Board of Education to file an application for a school building grant. Moved by Representative Dean, seconded by Representative Newberger. Is there somebody here to present this item? Thank you. Oh, here comes Sal. All right. Thank you. We didn't meet in committees last week, so if you could just give the body a brief overview of what they're voting on.
So hi. Okay. We believe that we can get some state reimbursement for some of our security projects that the town is bonding. In order to get school state reimbursement on the security projects, we need to form a committee and go through all the steps, and so this is the traditional way that the process works. So this will allow us to apply for state reimbursement for money that you've already approved.
Is this, maybe through either to you, Dr. Tyler, or the First Selectman, is this something that, did I hear you're going to give to the Special Projects Standing Building Committee, or this is a whole newly formed committee?
That's his.
Okay.
We have asked the Special Projects Standing Building Committee to take this on. They currently are also doing the Fairfield Woods roof project. I asked them if they could handle this along with that, and because of the nature of this being fairly limited in scope and time, they felt they could. So we're asking them, that's why the building committee is not coming through here. As soon as this is passed, they can get to work.
Thank you for the clarification. Does anybody have any questions? Representative Bateson.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Ed Bateson, District 1. Quick thing, I don't know to who, but I assume this is the school security stuff that we just did in the capital bonding. A couple months ago? Is this the second piece? Does that involve this? And I don't recall us, when we considered that, there was no net state offset. So are these new savings we're looking at? Because I remember this was, what was this, a $4 or $5 million project? Is that what we're talking about?
I'm going to ask Mr. Morabito to help with the price, but the issue is because we're applying for state reimbursement, one of the requirements for state reimbursement is that we have a building committee. So we are using a building committee, so we are eligible then for state reimbursement. The phraseology that you're voting on is one of the other requirements that we pass that by the legislative body, so we're eligible for state reimbursement.
Okay,
So I'll
if,
let Mr. Morabito determine whether it was in the numbers or not.
It is not included in the numbers, but the cost for the total this is one component of all of the security projects. So this is to help complete the project with the reimbursement that we will receive.
okay, that answers my question. My only concern then is when these bonds go to market, I think, just to Mr. Lesser, just make sure, we didn't pass anything that says authorizing the town to apply for state aid. I'm assuming that this now does that under that original appropriation, bond appropriation.
I think one of the standard phrases in most of the bonding resolutions
Okay, so you think we're covered that it's in there?
is that the first selectman is authorized to get any additional grants that would help offset this. So in
Okay.
essence, that's what we'd be doing.
That's my only concern. Just make sure that...
I would ask the town attorney to follow up just to confirm that. 'Cause I
That's
think-
fine. That's my only interest, that it's authorized under that original bond appropriation. That's my concern.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Representative Way.
Carol Way, RTM District 5. This brings to mind something that I had been thinking about over this past week, and it just seems like an appropriate time to ask. With proposed cuts to funding to education in certain towns and so on, is there the possibility that these grant programs will suddenly no longer exist as well? Because we have so many building projects that are out there where we have already, said that we were going to be applying for funding through a grant program. Do we have any clue?
It's not really germane to forming the committee, but I think
No,
the first
I know
selectman will
it's
help
not,
you answer it.
but it is something that did come to my mind this past week.
I was up along with Chairman Phil Dwyer from the Board of Ed and visiting with the Speaker of the House last week. We talked about a number of issues and what their thoughts are. They did not bring that up specifically, and our state delegation hasn't brought it back to my attention specifically. However, I think that's a good question. We will follow up on that, but at this point, we have no information saying that they will.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Any comments from the public? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions. Item carries unanimously. Item number 3, to hear, consider, and act upon the following resolution. Item number 4. To hear and consider budget reduction recommendations from the First Selectman and the Chairman of the Board of Education in order to address the potential state of Connecticut reduction and/or elimination of the education cost-sharing grant for the town of Fairfield in the amount of $3,583,484. May I have a motion to discuss? Representative Dean, seconded by Representative McCarthy. Mr. Dwyer, do you have any information you wish to share with the body? I called on you, Mr. Dwyer. Is there anything you wish to share with the body?
I have notes so that I don't drone on, if you would. So yes, I thank you for inviting me to talk about the educational needs. First, Philip Dwyer, Chairman of the Board of Education, about the needs of education as a priority in our town. Our board did meet as requested and remains convinced that we presented a budget that is financially responsible and contains tremendous savings from health insurance, implements our recently adopted district improvement plan, and currently stands at a 1.5% increase. The budget contains, as we said before, 4 risks at our budget hearing, and so there's, in our minds, right now, no room for cuts without making drastic reductions to programs and services. The BOE has always stood behind the budget that we have presented through first Selectmen discussions, Board of Selectmen discussions, Board of Finance discussions, and RTM discussions. Essentially, we have advocated for it, for the original budget, until the last vote is taken here in town. This year, we have an extra dynamic of a budget confusion up in Hartford that is of dramatic amount. And so we would still advocate that this body and the officials in town take whatever action is necessary to encourage Hartford to solve the problem in Hartford, not on the backs of our real estate taxpayers or on the backs of programs and services to students. And so whatever you need to do to advocate so that our delegation can effectively advocate up in Hartford is what we're in favor of. Now, eventually, you don't solve a $930 million problem without sharing the burden somehow. We have 3 proposals on the table at the moment. The Republican proposal has 0 cuts to ECS, for those of you who didn't see the Republican proposal this morning. The governor's proposal has it up to 3.6. There's more money on the town side, but I'll let the first selectman talk about that. The Appropriations Committee had a number of 1.2. I am absolutely convinced that eventually, if the Democrats and the Republicans in the legislature can debate the issue, that the towns will get a better deal from legislators who are watching out for their town all throughout the state than we will if we end up debating with the governor. So I hope that the Democrats and the Republicans in the legislature will find a meeting of the mind between the various proposals that are out there, because I think that will work to the best advantage. But if it doesn't, and we do have to absorb some cut, I would remind the RTM that when the purchasing department, by their contract, saved $350,000 to the Board of Ed budget, the town wanted to rely on that to balance the overall budget that year, and we delivered on that surplus. We could have, spent it on something, but we delivered on that surplus. When we realized a once-ever increase in retirements and realized $700,000 of saved money, we could have spent that. But it was in the town's best interest for us to put that money into the medical retention fund. The BOE did that. When we had that special education problem, when I say we, the staff, it's human beings that do this. The staff under Dr. Title's leadership found most of the money, went to the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and said, I found all of it but about $500,000. Can you stand behind that $500,000 and we'll continue to work? We could have relaxed and just said, okay, we have the $500,000, we're done. We didn't. We found the extra $500,000 so that the Board of Ed solved that problem within their budget. We know what it means to play nice in the sandbox. We know what it means to play ball. Not only philosophically we believe in one town, but practically, if we don't end up with an agreement that the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM says this was fair, well, you'll make me pay the price the next year. So it's incumbent upon us, for a lot of reasons, to say whatever the final issue is, let's address it. We are not interested in projecting what the state might do or might not do. And so making a cut in advance of a state decision just doesn't make sense to us, because it would require us to make too much of a dramatic cut to programs and services. So we all share in the burden of how to solve this problem, but at the moment I would say stay pat, have the Hartford try and find a solution that does not impact us, and then once we know what the number is, deal with it. Do you have any questions people want to ask, or shall I sit down?
Actually, if you would take a seat, and then we'll hear from the first selectman. If you could stay, though, in case there are questions. Thank you very much. Mr. Tetro.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. The, when I initially proposed a 1% budget, I thought this process was going to be a lot easier this year. The state has stepped up to complicate things a bit. Thank you for the chance to talk. A quick review of how we got here. There was a budget proposal back in my budget proposal back in January and February that was put together using the latest available information, which is our standard guideline. The governor's first budget proposal was out, and it had, I'm going to say no cuts, but certainly minimal cuts to Fairfield at that time. The BS reviewed that budget, modified and approved it. The Board of Finance reviewed that budget, modified it some and approved it. And the RTM got through your basic review process when the General Assembly Appropriation Committee issued some proposals concerning $550 million in cuts and about $1.2 million of cuts to aid to the town. And we addressed that at one of the meetings, at the subcommittee meetings we had earlier. The governor then went on to issue budget proposal 2, which cut $900 million and $4.6 million of town revenue. That's combined ECS funding of about 3.5 and state revenue sharing from sales tax revenues of about 1.1, for a total of $4.6 million, reducing our revenues. And that's kind of where we sit. I was able to visit the House Speaker last week along with Board of Ed Chair Phil Dwyer. We learned from our conversations there, one trivial point: Brendan Sharkey grew up in Fairfield. Went to Dwight School, Tomlinson Middle School, and Fairfield Prep. So that kind of helped ease the tension a bit in our conversation. We learned the governor's proposal really doesn't have any support on either side of the aisle up in Hartford. So that's been described as dead on arrival. The Democratic majority at the time was working on their budget proposal, and it was suggested that would be out mid to late this week. So between Wednesday and Friday later this week. As you saw, the Republican minority produced a budget proposal earlier today. At the time, when we met last Thursday, the Speaker said he was reaching out to the Republican minority leadership, which sounded like really good news since nobody up there seemed to be talking prior to that. I don't know what's happened with that, but it was good to hear him say he was going to reach out, and hopefully these two items have provided discussion documents. We know the governor's proposal is not moving forward. But we still don't know what the alternative is. We still don't know what state aid we'll be getting or not getting. We can propose it's more than zero and hope it's less than a $4.5 million cut. My recommendation, given that, is this body consider postponing the vote on our budget till we have that information. We really need a target number to know how we're going to share it here. We need to agree on how we're going to split that between the town, the Board of Ed, and a possible mill rate increase. Our budget increase now is at 0.8%. And so looking at that, I might propose that this board consider taking a third of that in a mill rate increase and taking the balance 2/3 and splitting that between the town and the Board of Ed and prorating that the way the budget breaks out, 55% for the Board of Ed and 45% for the town. That will cause problems for the Board of Ed, and that will cause problems for the town. Any cuts we make in this, and I'll remind you that the town side of the budget came in at less than last year, but any cuts we make in this of any significance are going to be felt by everybody. I asked the town attorney to look into the legality of our postponing the vote, both in the charter and in state statutes, and I believe the body had an opinion, legal opinion from the town attorney shared with you that shows that that's legal. I asked our CFO to look into the logistics. How many steps do we really need to get out tax bills? What point do they have to get out? What can we do from that standpoint? We also looked at other towns. We have the benefit of having our tax collector both has worked in other towns, but also was the president of the State Tax Collectors Association. She shared with us there are some towns that routinely miss July 1st and routinely go into the next fiscal year without a budget approved. I'd ask you to think of some of the smaller towns where it's not an RTM that meets, but the town meeting meets. Like all 500, 600, 1,000, whatever people get together and try and discuss and vote on the budget, and I don't suspect you'll find it surprising that sometimes they don't get that done by July 1st. So it is possible legally and logistically to go beyond that. Based on the conversations with the Speaker, he seemed to imply that this would get sorted out in May. He didn't promise that, but that was the implication in the conversations. I think there's another driving force, as you all know. This is an election year for the State Assembly. And as much as the governor has proclaimed loudly that he will call them into special session on May 5th and keep them there all summer until there's a budget, when that many folks have campaigns waiting back home, I suspect they want to get back home to cover those. All right? You can judge that on your own. I have no inside knowledge on that, obviously. I just think that's going to happen sooner rather than later. I do not believe there'll be a decision by May 4th, or in this case by May 2nd, but we'll know that by May 2nd. I don't see that happening. I think we have to prepare to consider alternatives. I think voting on a budget without knowing what the state answer is forces us to either overtax or cut more than we want of services or more than required, either one of which is not fair to our residents. So I'd ask you to consider a postponement vote when you meet on May 2nd. And thank you for the chance to make that recommendation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tetro. Since one of your proposals had to do with the mill rate, and this body, just so everyone's well aware, we don't have anything to do with the mill rate, and our chairman of the Board of Finance is here. Mr. Flynn, would you be able to address the mill rate issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. Good evening, everyone. It's unfortunate that I have to stand before you tonight under these circumstances, but not necessarily surprising. Working with John McKinney a couple of years ago, he warned that the state was in fiscal peril. And sadly, he ends up being true, and that's what impacted us and our town over the last few weeks. Now, that said, I don't even think then Senator McKinney thought that one of the proposals would be to actually transfer the tax from the state directly to the town as it relates to ECS. I think he would even be shocked at that, though I haven't spoken to him about it. I was certainly shocked by that, and it's unfortunate. 3 or 4 weeks ago, we voted on this budget as a Board of Finance, and we approved it, 8-1. And we stand behind this budget as recommended to you. We thought it was prudent. We thought it worked well for the government as it's now put together, organized. Those of you who have come to some of our public forums and addressed or seen our meetings, though, also realize that it's our board that has been asking for quite some time for a long-term strategic plan to help build the town of the 21st century relative to the services, the organization, and what we can perform, what we can afford. And in fact, I call on that again tonight. And I'm happy to know that we have a proposal together, and hopefully a committee being put forth soon to address that strategic plan, because as this shows, we need that now more than ever before, particularly with what's going on at the state level. Now, at the request of the moderator, I did informally poll most of the members of my board as it relates to this thought of perhaps changing the mill rate as a result of these reductions at the state level. And we haven't had a formal vote, but in fact, my board is strongly against increasing the mill rate any further to help absorb any of these expenses or any of these cuts. And here's the reasons. Number one, we believe it sets a bad precedent of raising taxes after the other boards have voted. We don't think that's fair. We don't think that's right. And going forward, we could do that, or a future board could do that under different circumstances. We don't think that appropriate. Though in the past, we have lowered it for better information, and I don't think anyone would argue with that course of action. Number two, we believe it sends a bad message to the state lawmakers that they can do what they want up in Hartford, and we'll just take the hit here in Fairfield. And we'll just increase taxes and move along our merry way. Number 3, generally it's our belief that we're not taxed too little, but that globally we spend a bit too much. Now I think locally, with the exception of us doing this long-term strategic plan, we've worked our darndest and worked hard with the Board of Selectmen as well as with this body to try to control our tax increases and try to be prudent with our dollars and try to do it the right way. And I think largely we've been successful. But we could be better, and certainly as the state is proving they could be better. And I want to throw some figures at you because this is mind-blowing to me. And this was, I went and looked this up, and I want to thank Brenda Kupchik's office, I want to thank Tony Wong's office, I want to thank Mr. Mayor for some of these stats I'm going to read to you, because it's pretty interesting. On an annual basis, the residents and the businesses of the town of Fairfield remit to the state of Connecticut over $260 million. Guess how much we get back? $12 million. If the governor's proposal went through, it would be $8 million. It's not a great return on investment, is it? We get 4% of what we give to the state back, and they want to knock it down to 3% of what we give to the state back. Now, if you take the total budget, or the $260 million that we give to the state, you add on the town's budget. I'm going to use round numbers here, okay? Another $270 million. That means the taxpayers in the town of Fairfield and state and local taxes pay $530 million a year. With a base of 60,000 people, not 60,000 taxpayers, 60,000 people, including women and children, men, women, and children, retirees, students, right, the disabled, everybody. It's 60,000 people paying $530 million worth of taxes. That's $9,000 per person per year. In state and local, doesn't even cover the federal. It's not that we're taxed too little. It's not that our citizens can always afford to pay more. And that's why it's dangerous to just think that we can raise the mill rate. And that's what we're worried about. Lastly, and very practically, while we did a good job with this year's budget, and I mean everybody, the first selectman, the administration, the Board of Selectmen, all the department heads, the Board of Education, Dr. Title with his great negotiations and getting us where we need to be on health insurance. Next year's a different year. And it looks a lot more difficult for the town next year. And sadly, it looks a lot more difficult for the state next year. So just resolving this year doesn't help us with next year. In fact, it could make next year worse. And we need to consider that. Because I would submit to you that's one of the reasons the state's in this issue now, is because they didn't spend enough time looking forward, but only looking for the quick fix that they could put in place now. And that hurt us all. So that's the position of my board as we stand right here. Again, we would have to take a vote in some weeks' time. I thank you for your time and your attention. I'm sorry that what before you is what I consider a prudent budget with some very difficult decisions to be made that was of no one's doing in this room. So thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for either Chairman Dwyer or First Selectman Tetro? I also want to recognize that State Senator Tony Wong has joined us. Representative Newberger.
Ray Newberger, District 6. I know it's very difficult to give a definitive assessment of where we're going to be, educationally speaking, without definitive numbers out of Hartford. But my question, through you, Madam Moderator, to Chairman Dwyer, at what point do we start cutting programs for educational programs? I know we have anywhere between $1 million, $2 million to 3.5, 3.6. At what point are the implications that we start cutting education programs?
There's one risk in the budget already that will result in cutting services and perhaps programs, but we won't know that until we know exactly how many sections we have to open and how much of that $455,000 that was cut, based on the assumption that we won't need any, will have to actually be spent. And so for every teacher we have to hire, that's an extra $75,000. Cut it in half and say that we end up with 3 extra teachers. That's $250,000 that we'll have to find somewhere in the budget, but probably will be able to be done nickels and dimes, various places, and may not result in any program services. Once you go beyond that number that is already baked into the budget that's in front of you, then you have to start making decisions to get any real numbers, and the answer that I gave during the budget hearings is still the same, that you look to looking and saying, well, maybe it's textbooks, maybe it's maintenance of buildings, maybe it's technology, and then you start getting into programs and services, and generally you would look at what programs and services are you offering next year that are new, that perhaps get off the table. But we're not putting any program on the chopping block at the moment. We're saying when we know the number, we'll deal with it.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Further questions? Representative Gale, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Hannah Gale from District 6, and my question is actually for Mr. Flynn. Where is he? Oh, sorry. Okay. So I am new to this, and I am using my rudimentary understanding of economics to sort of address the question of what really happened. So I looked at the residential listing that was sent to us today by Mr. Mayor and found my house on it, as is the first thing probably anyone does when confronted with that list. And the value of my home has dropped 1/3 of its value since we purchased it in 2003. And then I looked at some of the other homes that were near me and the other homes on the page, and it looked pretty consistent that homes really have dropped 1/3 of their value. And then I started Googling, and I was looking for what the sources of revenue were on the state level that may have been impacted by this drop in really wealth, cumulative wealth of the population of our town and probably of the state. And I noticed that some of the income came from inheritance taxes, and so that obviously would be implicated by real estate values. But then I kept Googling, and I saw that one of the real issues in the state of Connecticut, and this is sort of my question, like, is this true, is that on the state level we have a really low capital gains tax. And is that something that the town of Fairfield needs to address as part of our own interest in dealing with the state, that we can ask to our representatives, or am I wrong? I might be completely wrong, but that's my question.
1/3 of the value, huh? Yep. Remind me not to take real estate advice from you. Only kidding. Mine went down too. So the numbers that I quoted for the state were state income tax and state sales tax, and that comes up to the 260. Yeah. The capital gains would be part of the state income tax. We would have nothing to do with that at the local level. As to what the policy is on that, Senator Wong is here. He can speak to the capital gains tax, I'm sure, at the state level. Not that I'm looking to pass the buck, but it doesn't impact us here at the town level, since ours is based on the property tax and the assessment that you talked about, and how that is apportioned to everybody else. Okay?
Thank you.
I don't know if you'd like, I'm sure Senator Wong would be happy to, but that's entirely up to the moderator.
Are you comfortable with Chairman Flynn's answer, or did you want to chime in?
State Senator Tony Huang, but I also want to extend that the representatives are in session right now, because then I obviously would assure that they be here as well. in regards to our capital gains, the challenge is our state income tax is calculated as a result of capital gains. So in light of federal taxes, after you pay that, there is the calculation of capital gains that comes into our personal income tax. So that's the challenge. And it's in some ways, a very passive tax that has been pretty predictable. But unfortunately, as we've passed the budget in June 2015, we've seen a tremendous outflow of wealth and assets. So as a result, we are still trying to figure out how the taxes are being received in our state. And you know, our sales taxes were extended to April 18th, and that's the real challenge and the delay in this budget process is we're really not certain what our revenues are from those taxes, and we probably won't get them till late in April, maybe the 28th, 29th. So that's the real challenge in how our tax structure works in regards to capital gains tax and figuring out the calculation of revenue into our state. So, you know, and that's the real frustration. If we really thought properly, we would create our budget cycle far ahead of what our municipal budget is. But unfortunately, this is not the first time that the state budget has fallen behind municipal budget. But unfortunately, this is one in recent memory where there is so much draconian cuts and that it is so severely impacting our community that we're raising these questions. So I'd be happy to give you some more. I can get Kevin Sullivan from Department of Revenue Services to give you some exact breakdowns of how the calculation and percentages are. We'd be readily available to answer those questions in more detail when we have the data points for you. Okay? So thank you.
Representative Farnan, you had a question?
Brian Farnan, District 9. Through you, Madam Moderator, one more for you, Senator. First, thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you for proposing a budget that does not include these cuts. If we are to postpone our budget at the RTM, and what you're thinking that they'll be able to resolve this at some point, say, end of May, June? I mean, what's your current thinking on where the status of that is?
Easy question. The answer is the Republican caucus in both the Senate and the House presented today to the public a revised budget that differs significantly from the governor's proposed budget. And the first and foremost criteria for Fairfield, and I'm something that's very proud of, is we fully restored ECS funding back to the town. And that is something that was critical for me to insist upon. On that same breath, we also looked at making some significant structural changes. And some of the nuance of the budget is we also proposed a 5-year budget cycle, because that was one of the challenges as we go year by year. We found that there is such a unpredictable pattern, and it's causing such havoc in our communities. And the idea of a 5-year pattern gives you stability, gives you predictability, and also the opportunity for our municipalities to operate. But the challenge in timing, as you share, Brian, is this, and this is the troubling aspect of this, is the governor has one budget. We propose a budget. The Democratic legislative majority of the House and the Senate is yet to propose a budget, and they expect them to propose a budget this week, perhaps as early as tomorrow or at the end of this week. So the idea is we're going to have 3 different budgets out there with varying dollars, varying procedures, various cuts. You know, one of the things we talked about is making structural changes. You're going to have 3 different perspectives out there. The biggest challenge we have in this building right now in Hartford is the fact that the governor is not talking to the legislative majority leaders. And unless we all get into the room together to work to the best interest of our communities and our municipalities are kind of held hostage. So I am encouraged that we presented a budget as Republicans, but I also am anxious to see what the legislative Democratic majority is going to propose, and then for all of us, Republicans, Democrats, and the governor, to sit in a room to work out a deal that is in the best interest of all of our communities. But one thing is absolutely certain for me, that ECS education money must be restored in full. And then we also need to address structural changes for the year after, because unless we change how we govern at state level, we're going to revisit this over and over again. And that is unfair to our community, it's unfair to our residents, it's unfair to our children in the educational process. And you know what? That's not how you govern. I believe we have to govern on the premise of predictability so that governments and communities can manage their budgets and how they operate. But I also believe they have to operate on a level of sustainability. They can learn a lot from our community on sustainability. And I think the third is transparency.
Sorry, yes. I'm sorry, so there was a phone dinging. Can we just make sure it goes off? Did you have a question? No? With all that said, do you think that you'll vote on May 4th? Yes or no, or you don't know?
I wish in all of my heart and all my effort I would be up there 24/7 to do it on May 4th. But at this rate right now, unless we all get into a room together and work to the best interests of the state, I don't believe so.
Okay.
But this week could hold something very differently.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any further questions? Representative Ambrose, McCullough Way.
Peter Ambrose, District 1. Through you, Madam Moderator, to First Selectman Mike. Michael, assuming we don't get the funding we're anticipating, or we did anticipate getting from the state of Connecticut, and knowing, or now having been told, that there will be no increase in the mill rate, would you be adverse to talking to the unions to see if they'll accept furlough days?
I think simply, and what I tried to say before, is we really need to know what our target number is. Until we know what dollars we're trying to accomplish, it's hard to sit here and look at the full toolbox of what we might take a look at. But simply put, I don't think at this point you'd eliminate anything from being on the table. But I think without knowing the size of the problem, it's hard to figure out which solution is best.
So that's an open book for you. I mean, you're not adverse to working with the unions, or you can go into the unions and asking that question and trying to bring them to the table to somehow alleviate this this loss in tax revenue.
Yeah, at this point, we don't know what the loss in tax revenue is. We're all hoping it's less than what it was. There's nothing that says it can't be more than what it is now. So we need to know what that is and see what how it impacts us, how we're looking at splitting that between the Board of Ed and the town, and then go back and look at what our options are at that point.
Thank you.
Representative McCullough.
Mary McCullough, District 1. First, I want to thank Chairman Dwyer, Mr. Tetro, Mr. Flynn, the Senator. You've given us a lot to think about. And you know, I've had to think a lot personally lately about loss of revenue. And when that happened, I had to think about what options do I have. Anyway, I learned about this in an email, just maybe like all of you did, around April 12th. If you learned earlier than that, Mr. Tetro, or did you learn earlier than April 12th what the potential loss to the town was of loss of revenue?
You're
I mean,
Is
did you
that-
learn about the same time I did?
All right.
About the
I'm
loss of
going to
revenue?
suggest we all learned at the same time. I think the governor's
Okay.
proposal was released at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm not sure if that was the 12th
Okay.
or not, but...
All right, I
Yeah,
just
I
wanted to
believe
make
it-
sure we all kind of knew when we
believe it's
all
all this-
knew what we found out.
Yeah, my caution is that it is a proposal, and we've been informed, and I haven't found anybody at the State Assembly on either side of the aisle or in either house that believes that proposal has any hope of passing.
With respect to that, just knowing that there is the potential for some loss, was there any action taken, discussion, conversation with department heads or Dr. Title to say, here's where we are, we've got a quarter left in our fiscal year, is there discretionary spending that we can look at? I mean, when you're faced with the potential loss of revenue, I think everything's on the table. I mean, I know we don't know the answer. But it doesn't matter whether we have $10 in our pocket today, which we could make maybe 20, and whether you have 20 more on July 1st, then they're 20 better off. So I just want to make sure that everybody in the town that works for you and works for all of us really could be feeling some sort of loss. Did you ask them to take any action? Did you ask them to look at their budgets and see what money they had left in their budgets that hadn't been spent yet?
One, we're talking about next year, not this year.
I'm talking about this year.
Okay. In terms of managing this year to the maximum, we do that on a routine basis, and that's part of our quarterly review process. So yes, we are going through that. But to also more fully address your question, the presentation you all got tonight, I gave to the department heads last Tuesday morning to make sure they were on board, because not all of our department heads live in Fairfield. So I want to make sure that regardless of whether they were reading our newspapers or not, they understood where we were in the process, what has taken place, what was going on at the state level, and what the impact might be and how dramatic it might be to us. So yes, I covered that in the same detail I did here tonight.
Thank you. And I cannot express any more eloquently than you did, Senator, that regardless of what happens in Hartford, we have action to take as well. And we have to work together for some sort of resolution, regardless of what the outcome is in Hartford. And I wish us Godspeed.
Representative Way.
Carol Way, District 5. Madam Moderator, to First Selectman Tetro, through you. First Selectman, you mentioned about meeting with Brendan Sharkey and the Fairfield connection and all. I'm wondering, did you also meet with my state representative from the 133rd District? And when did you know about her voting with the Appropriations Committee to cut 1.2 million?
What's your point of order?
My point of order is that we are not to discuss or impugn elected officials.
I didn't hear any impugning at all. You may continue.
I was just asking in terms of, you mentioned having met with Brendan Sharkey and having been notified certain things about his opinion with what was happening with the budget. And I wondered if you had also met with State Representative from the 133rd District in connection with the role on the Appropriations Committee, and when you knew about the 1.2 million that was being cut there.
Just to be clear, as much as we were able to set up a meeting last Thursday with the majority leader, I've got a request in with Representative Kupchak to see if we can set up a meeting with the minority leader. And Mr. Dwyer has agreed to go back up with me when we can do that. So we've got kind of both sides covered on that side. In terms of the 1.2 million, I heard about that when the Appropriations Committee issued their, I don't know what they issued, their $550 million, or publicized their $550 million worth of cuts. There are a lot of issues in that, certainly, and there's a lot of things around that. I did not, certainly was aware of that. Also aware that Representative McCarthy-Vahey voted for the $3.5 million that enabled the Board of Ed to join the state health plan, and that saved major money on the Board of Ed side. So when you look at all the budget cuts, and the real question is, what's going to happen in the final budget?
Okay, but you did not speak with her about the 1.2 million, the educational cost sharing cut that she voted for in the Appropriations Committee.
In the
Madam Moderator,
Yes, go ahead.
the item on the agenda is to hear and consider budget reduction recommendations from the First Selectman and the Chairman of the Board of Education in order to address potential state connected reduction or elimination of the education cost sharing grant for the town of Fairfield in the amount of $3 million, etc. This does not speak to that.
I was following up with the talk about having met with Brendan Sharkey.
I believe the question is, have you followed up with Representative McCarthy, and is she going to, what is her position now on the 1.2 million that she cut? That is germane to the reductions.
And I think that question is one that should be asked of Representative McCarthy-Vahey.
Okay.
I don't mean to speak for her.
And one other part that I had to this question as well, in connection with, and this comes from my being chair of the Education and Recreation Committee and so on, with what Chairman Flynn has told us about the mill rate, not wanting to raise it and all, what concerns do you see in terms of the library, Parks and Rec, and even Public Works, changes that you might have to make in connection with your budget in that area?
I think this body's spent 3 nights reviewing the town budget, town proposal, and where we are. I think you've got the entire budget book in front of you, and I promise you that if we have to make any adjustments, they're coming out of that budget book.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Representative McCarthy. And then Representative Hurley.
I just follow Carol Way. Tom McCarthy, District 7. Couple of points. I couldn't agree more with a remark by our First Selectman and by our Chair of the Board of Ed, that at this point in time, the problem is in Hartford, and that's where our focus needs to be. Having said that, and I just want to ask, from the opening remarks of the First Selectman, hypothetically, in the event that some shortfall in funding comes to fruition, might I glean from your remarks that there's an agreement, at least in principle, of some level of sharing the pain between the town side and Board of Ed, prorated, as you alluded to?
To the best of my knowledge, there is no agreement. That is my recommendation to this body, but it's up to this body to decide, and this is the only body that gets to vote on that.
Understood. Just curious about any discussion along those lines. You just spent a whole car ride together, so.
I can promise you my recommendations haven't changed. I'm not sure Mr. Dwyer's have.
Okay. Just wonder what you guys talk about in the car. So.
a New York Giant, a Patriot fan? What are you kidding?
Michael Hurley, RTM District 10. Through you, Madam Moderator, to Dr. Title. For the benefit of this body, Dr. Title, and really my benefit as well, when you start off with the budget for the Board of Education, how does the education cost-sharing grant factor in?
That's actually revenue to the town, so we just listed in the budget book as revenue to the town, so it doesn't impact us at all.
I understand that it's revenue for the town, but it is entitled Education Cost-Sharing Grant, which means those monies are allocated to different municipalities so that they can use it to support the public education systems in those towns. Am I incorrect in thinking that? And if so, why do they then call it the Education Cost-Sharing Grant? I understand that it goes in to the revenue figure. Thank you.
Well, yeah, the theoretical basis of it is that the state imposes a number of requirements on the town in terms of operating a public school system, and that's one of the ways the state helps to offset that, but it's a municipal grant. And so when we do our budget, there's some revenue that comes from the state that we net off of our budget. So, for example, the excess cost grant for special education, that's revenue that comes directly to the Board of Ed. We estimate what that is, and we budget the net. And then if there's a shortfall there, we have to deal with it. But this is money that goes to the town, it's revenue to the town. We did not see any reduction coming, and so when we put the budget together, we listed the same number that we've been getting for the last 3 or 4 years in there, of about $3.5 million. And so there was no need to consider anything, because at the time we put the budget together, there was no contemplated reduction to it. So there was no reduction at that moment. We put the budget together. There was no reduction when it went to the Board of Ed. There was no reduction when it went to the Board of Selectmen. There was no reduction when it went to the Board of Finance. So at no time have we had to even consider a reduction, but it is revenue to the town, and as a result, is in the big pot of money that balances off the budget at the end. But it's not like some other grants where we get them directly and we actually budget the net.
I understand and I appreciate that, but just so I'm clear, you do, because at first you said that you didn't factor it in, but then you said, yes, you did factor it in. And I understand that this is difficult, for everybody. But I just want to be clear that the 3.6 is factored in when you're planning the budget, even though the money goes into the town side. Because based on what you said, if you knew you were getting a reduced number earlier on, things potentially could have looked differently.
It's a hypothetical. So you're saying, if we had known the budget was going to go down, would we have changed the budget? I don't know. It's a hypothetical. If we hadn't.
That's not what I said.
So, I mean, it was nothing that we considered because we didn't have to consider it. I don't know. Maybe I'm not understanding the question.
Representative
So-
Hurley, can you tie it into how it affects the
Yeah.
budget
I mean, I'm
recommendations?
not trying to be
Because the motion
difficult.
on the table is reduction, a recommendation for reductions.
I understand
where's
that.
your
We're having
driving
a
point
serious
for reductions?
conversation about a potential reduction of $4.5 million from the state, and all I'm trying to do is to understand how the Board of Education factors in the education cost-sharing grant into its budget. Plain and simple. That's all.
I think I answered it. Good. Maybe Phil can straighten this out.
Please.
When we're looking at our operating budget, we do not take into consideration the ECS grant. That's money on the town side. We have assumed that the police costs and the crossing guard costs and the nursing costs that are in the town budget, that the ECS grant helps contribute to that, to the interest costs that are in the budget for all of our capital projects. If you look at those 4 costs alone, those are higher than our ECS grant. And it's just another example of we have unfunded costs, and so that contributes a little bit to it, but not a lot. But in terms of our operating budget, we give it no consideration. It's just a note so that we know that the money is out there on the town side.
Okay, thank you. Madam Moderator, I have a question through you to the first selectman. My question is, in terms of the reduction to the ECS grant, and as well as the reduction to the tax revenue, when you were talking earlier, you were talking about, this being an election year, you don't expect the governor to keep everyone in budget session over the summer. Senator Wong stood up here and he would say, well, the Republicans just put out their budget plan. It has certain principles about restoring the ECS. We're waiting for the Democrat legislature to put out their budget. And it seemed to me as if you were being pretty dismissive of the governor's budget as that being something that's, dead on arrival. And I hope that's the case, because I think that would be the best thing for our town. But maybe I don't understand how it all works. I mean, he is the highest elected official in the state, so I think his budget has to mean something. And then secondly, have you spoken directly with the governor in opposition to his cut to the town of Fairfield?
Wow, a lot of questions. One, just to answer the whole first part of that, I have no idea what the governor's thinking and what he was doing in putting this together. So no, I have not been able to speak to him directly on that, but I've made it very clear up there that I'm not happy with that. That's why I went to speak to the Speaker of the House, and that's why I've asked to speak to minority leadership, because I believe that's where the budget's going to come from. And at this point, once the governor issued his budget, the next step is really what the State Assembly puts together, and that to me was a more crucial point.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? We're all done? All right. Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Item number 5, to consider and act upon any other matters presented to said meeting which may be properly acted upon under the rules of the representative town meeting. Seeing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Representative Ambrose, Representative McCarthy. Thank you. We stand adjourned. See you all on May 2nd.